November 9, 1940, General Sebastiano Visconti Prasca has been commanding the Italian invasion of Greece for exactly 12 days. He filed his first battle report on October 28th with the confidence of a man who has already written the victory speech. The Greeks, he informed Rome, would collapse before serious resistance. The terrain was manageable. The weather window was acceptable. The campaign would be concluded in short order. He was correct about one thing. It was concluded in short order. His command was, anyway. On November 9th, Mussolini fired him. 12 days. The man lasted 12 days in command of an invasion he had personally helped design, publicly championed, and privately assured the deuce would be over before Christmas. What he did not mention in his initial reports, what does not appear anywhere in his pre-invasion assessments, is what the Greek army was about to do to his divisions in the Albanian mountains. Nor does it explain what Prasca's successor, General Ubaldo Soddu, would later do while the front collapsed around him. Soddu composed film music, metaphorically. He sat in his headquarters in Tirana and wrote orchestral scores while Greek infantry pushed 50 kilometers into Italian-held territory, and his divisional commanders sent increasingly desperate messages, asking for ammunition they were not going to receive. The Italian campaign against Greece in the winter of 1940 to 1941 is one of the most thoroughly documented military disasters in the history of modern warfare. Not because of what happened on the battlefield, though what happened on the battlefield was extraordinary in the way that only a well-planned catastrophe can be extraordinary. It is documented because the Italian generals, alone among the armies of the Second World War, kept writing. They wrote to Rome. They wrote to Mussolini. They wrote to each other. They wrote memoirs after the war explaining, at some length, that nothing had been their fault. And what all those documents reveal, when you read them alongside the battlefield records, is not a story of military incompetence in the ordinary sense. It is a story of a military machine built to win a different war, against a different enemy in a different place, and then pointed at the Albanian mountains and told to go quickly. If you are watching this for the first time, please consider subscribing. This channel covers military history from the inside of the documents. The documents from this particular campaign will genuinely surprise you. Part 1. What Prasca believed. To understand the written record that followed, you have to understand what the Italian command believed going in. And to understand that, you have to start not in Albania but in Rome, 2 weeks before the invasion, in a meeting reconstructed from the notes of the Italian Chief of Staff, Pietro Badoglio. Badoglio did not want the invasion. He said so repeatedly in the documented record. His objection was not strategic. It was numerical. Italy, in October 1940, was already fighting in North Africa and East Africa simultaneously. The Albanian garrison was not prepared for a major offensive. The logistics chain into the Albanian highlands was essentially non-existent. The mountain divisions needed for operations in that terrain were not ready. Badoglio's own memo, dated October 15th, made the case that an invasion launched before spring would meet conditions the Italian military was not structured to handle. Mussolini read the memo and launched the invasion anyway on October 28th without fully briefing his army commanders in advance. Marshal Badoglio would later write in his memoirs that he learned the exact timing of the attack less than 24 hours before it began. Worth pausing on. Chief of Staff of the Italian Armed Forces found out the invasion was happening the day before it happened. Prasca did not share Badoglio's reservations. Prasca commanded the Italian forces in Albania and had been arguing for the Greek campaign for months. In his assessment, the Greek army was a second-rate force of roughly 30,000 men defending a frontier ill-suited to serious resistance. The Italian force of approximately 87,000 men in 8 divisions would push through the frontier positions in days, take the key port of Preveza within the first week, and reach Athens on a timeline that made the whole thing look less like a war and more like an administrative inconvenience. The 8 divisions were not, in the strictest operational sense, 8 ready divisions. Several were at half strength. Supply columns for the Albanian interior had been assembled in theory more than in practice. The mountain road network into the Epirus region of northern Greece, which was the operational direction Prasca had chosen, was approximately 1 road wide in places. None of this appeared in Prasca's initial dispatches. What appeared was a progress report tone that any reader of Italian military documents from this period would immediately recognize. The tone is not falsely positive so much as categorically or curious. An objective was not taken, but the reason it was not taken was always attributed to a factor that would be resolved shortly. A division was not advancing at the expected pace. It would accelerate once the supply situation was stabilized. The Greeks were resisting in one sector, but their flanks were exposed and would be turned. Each report described a situation that was always about to improve. The Greek army had mobilized 300,000 men and placed them under General Alexandros Papagos, who had spent months preparing positions in exactly the terrain the Italians were entering. The EV zones, the Greek light mountain infantry, were men who had grown up in those mountains. The Greek artillery was emplaced on ridgelines whose existence Prasca's maps had noted but whose tactical significance had not been incorporated into the Italian operational plan. The Giulia Division, Italy's elite Alpine troops, was sent through the Pindus sector on the operational assumption that speed would compensate for the absence of flank support. The Giulia moved fast. Within days it was surrounded by Greek forces on three sides, cut off in the mountain valleys, and fighting for its survival. The division extricated itself, after taking catastrophic casualties, by retreating back through terrain it had just crossed. The soldiers described the experience in letters home that bear almost no resemblance to the dispatches Prasca was filing simultaneously. Part 2. The letters that survived. There are two categories of primary documents from this campaign, and they do not agree with each other. First is the official record. General Staff telegrams, divisional situation reports, the command logs of the Comando Supremo in Rome, Mussolini's directives. These documents, held in the Archivio Storico dello Stato Maggiore dell'Esercito, describe a campaign that is always at an inflection point, always about to turn, always facing a specific obstacle that is in the process of being addressed. The second is the private record. The Ciano Diaries, kept by Mussolini's foreign minister and son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano, describe Mussolini's actual reactions as the campaign progressed. They are not flattering. Ciano records Mussolini waking at 4 a.m. on the night of November 8th and ordering him by telephone to inform the Greek government that Italy was about to take energetic measures against the Greek counterattack. The energetic measures were not specified. There were none available. Ciano also records Mussolini's rage when informed that his own generals had not told him the Greek counterattack was coming because the generals themselves had not known, because their intelligence networks in the Greek operational zone were, Ciano's careful diary phrasing, insufficient. The third category, which does not quite fit either of the others, is the letters. Italian soldiers wrote home from Albania in large numbers, and a substantial portion of those letters were preserved by Italian military censors who intercepted them and filed them because soldiers were not supposed to describe what they found in Albania in the terms most of them used. Those censored letters sit in Italian archives, and they paint a picture of the campaign that reads at times like a different war from the one the generals were reporting. One soldier from the Ferrara division, writing in early November, described his unit's supply situation with a specificity the official record avoided. His regiment had entered Albania carrying 3 days of rations. By day 7, the rations were gone and resupply had not arrived because the road behind them had become a river of mud after 2 days of rain that Italian meteorological services had not predicted and the plan had not accounted for. He wrote, eating olives from a farmhouse his sergeant had found abandoned and the olives were not sufficient. Another letter, from an officer of the Bersaglieri, described the terrain in terms that suggest the operational planners had studied the maps from a considerable distance. The Bersaglieri were Italy's elite light infantry. On flat ground, moving fast, they were exactly what their reputation claimed. In the gorges north of the Kalamas River, in November, in rain turning to sleet, moving fast was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable was whether anyone knew where the Greek machine gun positions were on the ridges above the route of advance. The officer wrote that no one did. What the letters show in aggregate is that the gap between what was being reported up the chain of command and what was happening on the ground opened within the first week and widened from there. The soldiers knew they were in trouble. Divisional commanders knew they were in trouble. The information reaching Rome was processed through a system built on the assumption that the campaign would proceed as Prasca had described, and the system struggled to accommodate data that contradicted the assumption. Part 3. General Soddu's solution. Prasca was dismissed on November 9th. His replacement was General Ubaldo Soddu, 57 years old, a career officer who had served in Ethiopia and was known within the Italian military as an able staff officer and an enthusiastic amateur composer. He had, before the war, written the scores for several Italian documentary films. He brought this enthusiasm to Albania. The documented record on Soddu's tenure, which ran from November 9th to late December 1940, contains one of the stranger command passages of the entire war. On the military side, the record shows a general who sent Rome a steady stream of reports describing a situation that was, in his consistent assessment, stabilizing. Personal side, it shows a man who spent a documented portion of his headquarters hours at the piano. His aide-de-camp, in a post-war memoir, described the scene at Tirana headquarters with the careful language of a man who had served his superior and still needed to say something true. Soddu could be heard composing at his piano in the evenings while his staff officers worked through the night on the supply problem. The supply problem was not small. By late November, multiple Italian divisions were holding defensive positions they had not expected to be holding, because they were supposed to be 50 kilometers further south in Greek territory. They were holding those positions in Albanian mountains in winter, without adequate winter equipment, on supply lines that could not get vehicles through the mud and could not get enough mule trains organized to substitute for the vehicles. Italian soldiers were developing frostbite in boots that had not been issued because the quartermasters had not planned for a winter campaign, because the plan had assumed a campaign ending before autumn. Soddu's telegram to Rome in early December, preserved in full in the Archivio Storico, contained the sentence that has become, for Italian military historians, clearest single expression of what was happening. He wrote that without immediate reinforcement of significant scale, the front could not be held. He used the phrase that only a miracle could restore the situation. He sent this telegram from a headquarters where, according to the same aide-de-camp's account, he then returned to his piano. This is not a standard reading of military command collapse. Standard accounts tend toward either the morally framed version, where incompetent generals failed brave soldiers, or the structural version, where systemic problems made failure inevitable regardless of individual decisions. What the documents from the Soddu period suggest is something more specific. The Italian command system in Albania in November and December 1940 had separated into two layers operating on different assumptions. The lower layer, the divisional commanders, the regimental officers, the platoon leaders writing letters home, understood what was happening. They were in the mountains. They could see the supply carts that had not arrived. They could count the ammunition they had left. They reported what they saw. The upper layer, Soddu's headquarters, Rome, Mussolini, was processing those reports through a framework constructed in the confident weeks before the invasion and never rebuilt when the invasion went wrong. The framework said the situation was stabilizing. The incoming data said the situation was catastrophic. The framework won most of the battles for institutional attention right up until the moment it could not. That moment came in December 1940. Greek forces in the southern sector, advancing across what was now unambiguously Italian territory in Albania, captured the town of Gjirokastër on December 8th. The Greeks were not defending anymore. They had been inside Albania for weeks, occupying territory the Italian army had held for 18 months, and they showed no signs of stopping. Soddu was replaced in late December by General Ugo Cavallero. Before departing, Soddu filed a final assessment of the command situation. It is, by the standards of the documents produced during his tenure, unusually candid. He noted that the forces available were insufficient for the mission, as originally conceived, that the supply infrastructure had not been adequate from the start, and that the Greek military had been substantially underestimated at every level of the planning process. He did not mention the piano. If you are finding this account useful, please hit the like button. What this channel tries to do is follow the paper trail that official histories tend to skip. The paper trail from Albania in the winter of 1940 is one of the most revealing in the entire war. Part 4. What the documents actually say. Cavallero stabilized the front through early 1941 by doing the things that should have been done in October. He organized the supply lines. He got winter clothing forward. He stopped the Greek advance at considerable cost. By March 1941, after Germany had made clear it would intervene in Yugoslavia and Greece by early April, the Albanian front had settled into an attritional stalemate that both sides were losing slowly. Germany intervened on April 6th. Within 3 weeks, the Greek army, facing Wehrmacht armored columns from the north through Yugoslavia, while holding the Italians in the west, collapsed. Greece fell. The Italian army marched into Ioannina and Athens behind the Germans, and then the generals started writing. The post-war memoir literature from Italian officers who served in the Greek campaign is one of the more unusual bodies of military writing to emerge. From the Second World War, it is unified by a single consistent structural feature. Each general, writing his own account, identified the causes of the disaster with considerable precision, and those causes were always located somewhere other than the author's own decisions. Prasca published his memoir, Io ho aggredito la guerra, in the late 1940s. He argued at length that he had been given an inadequate force for the mission, that his logistical requests had been denied by Rome, that the terrain was more difficult than his maps had indicated, that the Greek mobilization had been underestimated by intelligence services for which he bore no responsibility, and that he had been dismissed before he could execute the flanking maneuver that would have reversed the situation. He was correct about several of these points. The force was inadequate. The logistics were inadequate. The intelligence was wrong. These facts do not particularly help Prasca's argument because Prasca had been the general who told Rome the force was sufficient, the logistics acceptable, and the intelligence reliable. Soddu did not publish a memoir. His aide-de-camp's account, published decades later, is the nearest thing to a Soddu perspective that exists in the record. It is not unkind to Soddu, but it is honest about his limitations. The phrase used is that Soddu was a man of considerable administrative talent who found operational command in fluid conditions difficult. This is a generous translation of what the primary documents show, which is a commander who reported stability while presiding over collapse and found comfort when the reporting became untenable in music. The Ciano diaries are the most revealing single source because Ciano had access to Mussolini's private reactions and had no reason, at the time of writing, to construct a defense for posterity. He was writing for himself. What the diaries show is a Mussolini who genuinely believed for the first 2 weeks that the situation was as Prasca had described. Then a Mussolini who believed the situation was recoverable with reinforcements. Then a Mussolini who needed a scapegoat. Scapegoat was Prasca. Then another scapegoat, and that second scapegoat was Soddu. And finally, a Mussolini who began attributing the campaign's failures to forces he could not name with any specificity, using language that Ciano recorded with his characteristically dry observation that the Deuce seemed to believe the problem was metaphysical rather than logistical. The metaphysical explanation had a certain internal logic. If you accepted the pre-invasion assessments at face value, the outcome was genuinely difficult to explain through ordinary causes. The Italian military was larger, better equipped, by any conventional measure more modern than the Greek army it had attacked. It had armor, aircraft, artillery, the enormous advantage of having chosen the time and place of the attack. The Greeks had mountains, weather, zones, a general who had prepared positions in the right places. The mountains matter more than anything else in the documents. The gap in the Italian record is not between bravery and cowardice, or between good troops and bad troops. Italian soldiers in Albania fought, in many cases, with extraordinary courage under conditions that the command system had not prepared them for. The Alpini of the Giulia division, surrounded and outnumbered, fought their way out of encirclement over several days at severe cost. The Bersaglieri units that found themselves in terrain completely unlike the open ground they had been trained for, adapted as best they could, and often died in the attempt. The gap is between what the terrain demanded and what the Italian military had been built to supply. The Italian army of 1940 was a combined arms force oriented toward mobile warfare on open ground. Its logistics were built for mechanized columns on roads. Its doctrine was built for rapid advances against positions identified by reconnaissance. Its junior leadership was trained to execute orders from above rather than adapt to conditions below. The Albanian mountains in November 1940 were not roads. The Greek defensive positions had been prepared in terrain that Italian reconnaissance had penetrated. The orders from above were based on a map that had been accurate enough in peacetime and was wrong in the ways that mattered. When the Julia Division walked into the Pindus sector, it walked into a trap set not by Greek cleverness but by Italian planning. The operation assumed the Greeks would not contest the terrain seriously. The Greeks contested it seriously. The operation assumed supply lines would function in the Albanian autumn. The Albanian autumn produced conditions the supply system had not been designed for. The operation assumed the Greeks had 30,000 men. They had 10 times that. These were not secrets. Greek mobilization had been visible to Italian intelligence. The Albanian road network was known. The seasonal weather was not unpredictable. What the planning had done in producing its confident assessments was weigh each of these factors and assign it an acceptable probability of not mattering. The individual probability estimates may have been defensible. The aggregate was not. Part 5. What they could not write. The most revealing documents from the campaign are not the ones that explain the failure. They are the ones that cannot explain it. There is a category of Italian military document from the winter of 1940 that appears in the archive with a characteristic pattern. The document begins with a situation report. The situation report describes a problem. The document then moves to a recommended solution. The solution involves either reinforcements that were not coming or a Greek withdrawal that did not occur. The document then concludes with a confidence statement. The confidence statement is the tell. In every case, it is written in the same institutional tone, using variations on the same vocabulary. The situation is difficult but manageable. The troops are exhausted, but maintaining their positions. The enemy has gained temporary local advantages that will be reversed by the forthcoming offensive. These statements were written by professional soldiers who understood perfectly well that the situation was not difficult but manageable. They wrote them anyway because the reporting system required them, and because the reporting system had been constructed on an assumption of eventual success that the writers had internalized to the point where departing from it required something they could not quite produce. What they could not write was direct. The plan was wrong. The plan was built on assessments that did not reflect the situation on the ground, prosecuted with forces that were inadequate for the mission, in terrain that the doctrine could not navigate, against an enemy that had been divided by 10 in the planning documents and turned out to be the real number. Prasca came close to this in his memoir, but he framed it as something that had been done to him rather than something he had done. Soddu came closest in his December telegram, but the miracle framing located the solution outside the command rather than inside it. Mussolini never arrived at it at all. The Ciano diaries record him producing, in private, increasingly elaborate explanations for the disaster that involved Italian racial characteristics, Greek racial characteristics, the weather, the terrain, and by January 1941, the treachery of his own generals. The German intervention in April 1941 saved the Italian army from having to produce the document that would have described what had actually happened. Germany took Greece in 3 weeks. The Italian army marched in as a secondary party to someone else's victory. The official histories could be written around the final outcome rather than the preceding months, and they were. The gap in the record is not a gap of documentation. There is plenty of documentation. The gap is between what the documents say and what they mean. Taken together, when you read the Prasca dispatches against the soldier letters, the Soddu telegrams against the Ciano diaries, the confident command assessments against the censored accounts of frostbite and missing ammunition, they mean something the Italian generals could see but could not put into a report. They had not built the wrong equipment. They had not hired the wrong soldiers. They had not even, in most cases, made the wrong decisions within the system they were operating. They had built a system for a war on flat ground and pointed it at mountains. The Greeks understood the mountains. The Greeks had built their force, their logistics, their doctrine, and their defensive planning Around the specific conditions of the specific terrain in the specific season, the Italians had chosen to attack. The Evzonzans were not sophisticated soldiers in the way that the Italian Alpini were sophisticated soldiers. They were men who knew the ground they stood on at a level of precision that no Italian officer, reading the maps in Rome in October 1940, could match. The Alpini of the Giulia Division were arguably the best mountain troops in the Italian army and among the best in the world at that time. They were sent through the Pindus sector with supply lines that could not support them and no effective flank protection. Their quality was not the issue. The quality of the planning around them was. Prasca's dispatches said the plan was sound. The soldier letters said the plan was a fiction. The official documents said the situation was stabilizing. The Greek order of battle said Greek forces were inside Albania and still advancing. Both bodies of evidence are real. Both are preserved in the same archives. The reason Italian generals could not explain what happened is not that they lacked the intelligence to understand it. Several of them understood it quite well, as their post-war writings eventually showed. The reason they could not explain it, in the documents they produced at the time, is that explaining it accurately would have required them to describe a command process that had failed, at the level of conception rather than execution. And the command process that had failed was the one they had built and certified and sent Rome its confident assessments about. Explaining that would have meant writing a document that read in essence as follows. We told you the plan was sound. The plan was not sound. The Greeks were not what we said they were. The terrain was not what we described. The supply chain we reported as adequate was not adequate. The weather we did not mention was winter. The troops we committed were not sufficient and were not properly equipped for the conditions we were sending them into. We knew some of this and chose not to include it. We did not know the rest of it, but we presented our ignorance as certainty. The result is what you see. No Italian general wrote that document. They wrote the other documents instead. The Greek army held Gjirokastor until April 1941. The Italian command in Albania produced 17 months of reports describing a stabilizing situation. The German Wehrmacht crossed the Yugoslav border and ended the war in Greece in roughly the same time it took a supply convoy to travel from Tirana to a forward position in the Albanian highlands. Verdict: go back to Prasca on October 28, 1940. The confidence in his first dispatch is not performed. He believed what he wrote. He had been planning this campaign for months, had argued for it to his superiors, had built his operational plan on assessments that came from a system he trusted. The system he trusted had not been designed to assess an Albanian mountain winter against a mobilized Greek army with local knowledge and prepared positions. It had been designed to assess a linear advance against a frontier force on a conventional axis of approach. It had been given those parameters, and it returned the expected answer. When the answer proved wrong, the system did not produce a corrected answer. It produced the same answer in revised language while the soldiers at the front wrote home about olives and frostbite. The Italian generals wrote after Greece humiliated them in Albania because writing was what the system required. The system required confidence assessments, situation reports, reinforcement requests, and eventual recommendations that someone else be held responsible. It did not require, and could not accommodate, the document that the historical record eventually assembled from all of them together. That document says the plan was wrong from the first day. The terrain was never manageable. The enemy was never 30,000 men. The supply chain was never adequate. The weather was always going to be winter. The generals who designed the campaign and certified the assessments and filed the confident dispatches knew enough of this before the first soldier crossed the Albanian border that the outcome, while not inevitable, was considerably more foreseeable than the documents they produced suggest. The Greek army did not defeat the Italian army in Albania. The Italian planning documents defeated the Italian army. The Greeks simply appeared where the planning documents had said they would not be. That is what the generals wrote, and that is what they could not write. Both are preserved. The distance between them is measured in exactly the documents that survive. If this examination of the written record has given you something to think about, please hit the like button. It helps this channel reach viewers who care about what the primary sources actually say rather than the version that ended up in the summary. Subscribe if you want the next account, because the story of how Italy rebuilt from the Albanian disaster, what the internal documents from that process reveal about what the command understood and when it understood it, is considerably more interesting than the official narrative suggests. The generals had names. The soldiers they sent into the Pindus without winter boots had names too. Both deserve to be understood rather than simply remembered.